So we started saying that in addition to the Torah, there was this ancient Babylonian creation myth called Enuma Elish. And what's interesting is that in Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, the world is created out of a titanic battle between the different gods with a small g. The different deities fight each other for supremacy, for control, for dominance, for hegemony. That's how the world is created. In Judaism, in Torah, the world is created by one solitary, transcendent being, God, which is beyond nature. As we said, we learn from the beginning of the Torah that if God created the heaven and the earth, it means that nothing in the world is God, and nothing in the world should be worshipped or served as God. Because if God created the world, God is external, transcendent to the world. Another thing I want to say is that the Torah starts with the universal. Adam and Eve are not Jewish, right? They're Roman Catholics. No, I'm kidding. They're of no religion. And the sages ask, why did God create Adam and Eve? Why does the Torah doesn't say they had any parents or lineage? You know, there's a beautiful story that Rabbi Wolpe likes to say again and again about Winston Churchill's father. You know, British society is a very class-oriented society, and it's very much about nobility and familial pedigree and lineage. So somebody once came at a dinner party to Winston Churchill's father and asked him, whose descendant are you? You know, any of your grandparents were lords or dukes or what have you, all this nonsense. So he said to him, I am not a descendant, I am an ancestor. Meaning my descendants will be great. And he was right, because his son became Winston Churchill. So the rabbis say, why was Adam created in the second creation story, in the second chapter of the Torah, solitary? And the answer is, say the rabbis, so that nobody could say, and I'm giving my own silly translation into simple American English, the Midrash says in Rabbinic Hebrew, so nobody would say to another person, hey, my father was a big shot, your father was nothing. My father was a CEO, my father was a professor, whatever it was, and your father was whatever. To create that, to prevent that sense of socioeconomic patronizing, it doesn't even say that Adam was of a certain ethnicity, right? So the Torah narrative kind of does away with that. Now notice, so the Torah starts with the universal, humanity, Adam, Eve, their descendants. They are not of a particular ethnicity, they are not of a particular geography, and they are not of a particular ideology or faith. Rather, the Torah emphasizes we're all in God's image. We all have non-negotiable human dignity, and we all are a unique manifestation and expression of Almighty God, right? Somebody wrote a book called The Republic of Hebrew Letters, and in that book, that person argues that if you want to understand where democracy and human rights come from, you don't necessarily need to go to ancient Greek philosophy, you need to go to the Torah. And the idea that we are all equal before God, and that Moses, when he makes a mistake, needs to be held accountable. King David makes a mistake. Nobody gets any discounts. Everybody's equal before the divine, and everybody's equal before the law. That is a precursor to modern-day liberal democracy and human rights, right? We've seen presidents and prime ministers, let's say in Israel, go to prison. We've seen in this country in the 70s a president that had to resign and get a presidential pardon, otherwise he would have gone. So nobody's above the law. And many would argue, if you want to look for the source of it, that is the revolutionary Torah idea that we're all created in God's image. So we're all inherently equal. And then it translates itself into political values. Both in the times of the Hebrew prophets, their goal was to speak truth to political power. You know, Jeremiah was thrown in jail. Eliyahu Navi, had to run for his life to the desert, otherwise the king and queen of the time would have killed him. So speaking truth to power. And There's a beautiful thing that Rabbi Sessler says. He says one of the leading secular thinkers of modern times, Nietzsche, said that life is about the will to power. I want power. Let's see, if I'm a good-looking person, I'll try to get power through my looks. If I'm an attractive person. If I'm really good at science, I'll try to get through being a scientist. If maybe I'll try and be a politician. I'll try to make lots of money. Get a prominent position in some organization. People try to get power. That's what makes people tick. The will to power. Comes Rabbi Sessler and says Judaism is not about the idea of power. It's about the power of ideas. The idea that we're all equal before God. That we should treat each other with empathy. Right? So Judaism is not about the idea of power and control. Judaism is about the power of ennobling spiritual and moral ideas. Which brings us to the next point, that Judaism is also a critique of empire. Abraham leaves Mesopotamia, which was the kind of superpower of his day, and he moves to a marginal peripheral place called Canaan, that we call Israel today. It's very unusual. It's like somebody moving from Los Angeles or New York City to the Ivory Coast or to Ghana. Usually, if you look at historical migrations, people move from poor, more peripheral places to the places where all the action is, economically, culturally, scientifically. But here, we see Abram is moving from the heartland of the empire, Mesopotamia, to the periphery. Similarly, we move out of Egypt as a people under Moses' leadership to the periphery again, to Canaan, to Israel. And that is very interesting. Also, the story that we tell ourselves as a people, our narrative, our national narrative, is a story. We sing around the Passover table. We say, Avadim Ayinu. What are we saying? We're saying we used to be slaves. What kind of people say, we went through genocide in Egypt. Pharaoh said, murder all the male infants, and we were dehumanized, and we were subjugated, and we were slaves. Our story is that we were helpless. We were the oppressed. We were the underdog for centuries, and then we were liberated. Usually, nations tell themselves an antithetical story. They say, we were always here. This was always our land, and we always controlled it, and we were always strong. Right? We tell ourselves a very different story that's very much reflective of the American story, right? People who came by boat to America, like you did, Mrs. Ben Simon, right? Those who came to New York saw Lady Liberty, the statue, with a Sephardic Jewish poet, Am Elazar, says, bring me your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. And there's a lot to be said about that. The Christian minorities who escaped oppression in Europe, religious oppression, and came here, they thought they were reenacting the Exodus. Instead of the Red Sea, it was the Atlantic Ocean. Instead of Pharaoh, it was King George. But they thought it in the same way. And of course, the Exodus also inspired the civil rights movement and Dr. King. And many people say our story of liberation, the Exodus, is humanity's great narrative of hope. That marginalized, oppressed groups can redeem themselves and acquire human dignity and autonomy. So, Judaism is a critique of empire. Ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, and also ancient Israel. When you read the Hebrew prophets like Amos, and Jeremiah, and Isaiah, they are rebuking the Jewish kings and queens of their time for social and economic and moral corruption. Right? So, Judaism at its best is from a position of spiritual and moral integrity, criticizing the political and economic powers of the day. Right? Now, at the end of our parsha, I'm going to start from the end, we have the story, almost at the end, the Tower of Babel. Very interesting story, right? And that, by the way, the word in English, babbling, talking nonsense, comes from the story of the Tower of Babel. And the story basically says that there was, at that point in history, there was cultural and linguistic uniformity. It says at this point, the whole earth was safa achat, everybody spoke one language, maybe American English, whatever. According to the Midrash, it was Hebrew. and there were only several words. There was very little cultural, linguistic, ethnic variation. It was a very boring world. They didn't have Jewish Fairfax, and they didn't have downtown Koreatown, they didn't have Chinatown. It was all kind of boring. It was one kind of humanity. And the people said, let's build a skyscraper, like the Sears Towers in Chicago, and we'll make a name for ourselves. Everybody who comes would want to look at this tower. And then it says that God heard this, and he destroyed the tower. Now, what is the conventional reading? The conventional reading is that the people, first of all, it's political and religious satire against the Mesopotamian Empire. In Mesopotamia, they would build these long, tall buildings and say, you walk up here, and you walk up here, and you'll get to God. You'll be able to you'll be able to climb on high until you reach the heavens. And the Torah is making fun of that idea. It's basically saying people who have such an infantile theology that they think that God is an elderly person in the sky and they want to build a building to get there, it's a little ridiculous. It's not very evolved spiritually and theologically. So first of all, it's a satire. Secondly, the great-grandfather of Rabbi Soloveitchik was a rabbi in 19th century Europe. His name was Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda, Berlin, like the city of Berlin. And he was a very modern thinker in a sense. And he said, it says in the story of the Tower of Babel, they said, let's take some bricks, let's take some cement, turn it into bricks and fire, and we'll have a technology to build a skyscraper. So he tells a story, the Netziv, building on all kinds of rabbinic commentaries, midrashic commentaries, that there was no value for human life. If somebody would fall off as they were building the skyscraper, say, oh no, he had all this raw material in his hand. What a waste of bricks that this person fell with several bricks. Instead of thinking about the sanctity of life that was lost, they were lamenting the loss of material resources.
Not workers' compensation.
Exactly. They didn't worry about that. And there were later commentators like Yeshayahu Leibovitch, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs wrote a book after 9/11 called The Dignity of Difference. They took this story from our Parsha and explained what does this great 19th century rabbi, the Netziv, says. He says the danger of what the Tower of Babel's generations did. They're called Dor HaPlaga, the generation that was dispersed, is that first of all they had hubris, what the Greeks called hubris, arrogance. They thought that we can become gods, humanity will deify ourselves and challenge God's supremacy. We saw that at the beginning of modern times with the French Revolution. People said we don't need God, we just use our faculty of reason and human intelligence, we'll solve all the problems, medical, scientific, socioeconomic. Unfortunately, the French Revolution turned into a bloodbath with a guy called Robespierre. They executed tons of people. It was a reign of terror with the guillotines. The Russian Revolution also said, scientific socialism, we don't need God. 20 million people murdered. The same thing with Chinese communism, right? So this whole notion that you can challenge God was really a ludicrous notion. And in addition to that, so there was this idea that we can overthrow God and take control through building the Tower of Babel. And that reminds us, lahavdil, about something in Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, there's a figure called Prometheus. And Prometheus said, I'm going to steal the fire from the gods, and then I'll have control of everything. Why fire? Think about fire. Fire leads to technology. Technology leads to the internet and everything we have today. So he said, I'll steal the fire from the gods and I'll control everything. And in Greek mythology, the story is that he was tied to a rock and eagles devoured his innards. Something very terrible. But here's the point. The people who built the tower, says the Torah, wanted to perpetuate a reality in which there is only one language and very little cultural differentiation. And God didn't like that, and God destroyed the tower, not because God was nervous that we're challenging His supremacy, but rather it's because God wants diversity. God created us diverse and different. There's one of my favorite midrashic teachings of all times is that when a human being mints a coin, like if you go to DC and see how they make quarters, basically every quarter or every dime or every nickel look the same. But when a human being fashions a human face, every human being has a unique face, unique features, right? So God sees human diversity, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, religious, not as a source for lamentation, but as a source for celebration. Because we are unique, each one of us can make a unique contribution, whether it is as a culture or as an individual. And these people didn't understand that. They wanted everybody to be the same. They wanted everybody to speak American English. And that's a very powerful teaching. Because if you look at the 20th century with communism and fascism and Nazism, all the great secular ideologies that took away hundreds of millions of lives, they really wanted to impose one way of being in the world on all of humanity. And it's as if God is telling us, no, I want you to be dispersed. So God destroys the tower, disperses humanity across the world, and creates multiplicity of languages. And it's a great story. We still live in an age where people are afraid of difference, of the fact that God made us different. And there are people of different ethnicities, and there are people of different innate biological proclivities and tendencies, like people who are attracted to their own gender, right? We still have people who are afraid of the way God created humanity, right? And in my opinion, it's not only an affront to human dignity, it's also an affront to God. Because God created those people and these groups and these variations. So I'm starting with the end because I think it's a very, very deep story. The story of the Tower of Babel is telling us that diversity and differentiation is a mitzvah and it's God's will. You know that the last speech, you can watch it on YouTube if you like, that Ronald Reagan gave as president, he shared with the public a letter that he received from an immigrant. I wrote an article about it a few months ago. And he says there, somebody who came to America like most of us around this table did. We came from another place. And that person wrote to President Reagan, you know, you can move to Japan, you'll never really be Japanese. You can move to France or Germany, you'll never be French or German. But in America, it's different, you know. And Reagan went on to say that the day that we close our minds and doors to diversity will be the beginning of the end, of the demise of America's greatness, right? And that's why even a place that's sometimes very critical of America politically, like France, the day after 9/11, 2001, the headline in one of France's leading papers, Le Monde, was "Nous sommes tous Américains." We're all America, right? So it just shows us, I think, in a very powerful way, the genius of the Torah. The Torah takes a seemingly simple story, like the story of Tower of Babel. Look what an incredible message it gives us about individual human dignity and about what people call today multiculturalism, right? And that's why the book of Zohar in the Kabbalah says, woe to he or she who think that the Torah is mere stories. The stories are an epic garment. But if you go into the inner layers of the story, what you see is that Torah is a very sophisticated life philosophy, right? If you analyze those stories. So that's about the Tower of Babel.
You know, Rabbi,
Yes, please.
something you said at the beginning, that God wanted us to be all equal, and
Right. Mm-hmm.
I'm always amazed how United States, the Jews, the big majority
Mhm.
are Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
A few decades ago, I would say it was like
90%.
90%.
Now it's like 70.
Now it's
Yeah.
down. But does this have something to do with
I
it?
think so, 100%, because the Democratic Party historically and to this day is a party that is supported by and is very sympathetic to minorities. African Americans, 90% vote Democrat. I don't know what the Hispanic demography is electorally, but we've always felt that we're a minority here, and as a minority, we want to side with the party that is sensitive to minority rights.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that's changed and is now changing again is that Jewish Americans became part of the political and economic and scientific and cultural elite of this country. It's not by accident that our president now, Donald Trump, his daughter married a Jewish man and converted. I think he has another child who married a Jewish person. Al Gore, who was really elected in terms of the popular vote in 2000, at least one of his two daughters married a Jewish American guy. Chelsea Clinton married a Jewish guy, and I can continue on, and it shows you a trend that Jewish Americans became part of the elite of this country. And once you become part of the establishment, you're no longer a minority. Maybe you're a minority in terms of demographic numbers, but mentally, socioeconomically, educationally, you're no longer a minority. And I think that's why today almost a third of Jewish Americans vote Republican. But now we have an upsurge of xenophobia and the hatred of foreigners, and the white supremacists are coming up again, and we've had Jews murdered in two synagogues in the last less than a year. So now we are understanding again that it's not so simple. We're we're about maybe 3% of the population here, and there are still millions, maybe out of 300 million, maybe even tens of millions, maybe 20 million Americans, less than 10%, are anti-Semitic. And we're starting to understand that it's not so simple, right? But I think you're right, and let me strengthen your observation that during the civil rights movement, Jews excelled disproportionately in leading the civil rights movements. The day that Martin Luther King, Dr. King, gave his famous "I Have a Dream," one of the greatest speeches of modern times, of all times, there were 3 other rabbis who spoke. He's Christian clergy, obviously he was a reverend, but there were 3 rabbis who spoke. Abram Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest Jewish theologians and religious thinkers of the second half of the 20th century, also had a large Christian following. He marched with Dr. King arm in arm. And when they marched in Selma in the south, Heschel said, "When I marched in Selma, my feet were praying." So, demonstrating for human rights and holding a Torah as you march was an act of divine worship and serving God. So I've read that 51% of the lawyers in the South were Jewish during the civil rights movement. So it's inculcated in our historical and moral DNA, right? And it's not only because we were slaves in Egypt in the Torah narrative, it's also because we were dhimmi, we were second class in Islamic societies. It's also because we underwent genocide in Europe in the very recent past. So there is something about our set of values from the Torah, our spiritual and moral code, and there's something about our history, including our very recent history of your lifetime, right? The Holocaust and the Exodus for the Islamic lands in your lifetime. that makes us very sensitive to universal human suffering. And I think that has a connection.
I didn't understand what she meant, like when you said it has to do with this parasha has to do with Democrats.
What I'm saying is that Jews tend to vote Democrats because the Democratic Party historically has been very committed to civil rights. Even though, if you look back in history, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican and he emancipated the slaves. If you look at more recent history, let's say 6 decades ago, it was President Kennedy and President Johnson who really legislated the bulk of the civil rights legislation, putting an end to segregation in the South and all those things that it's hard to believe that people had to die in this country like 6 decades ago so that everybody can use the same bathroom and drink from the same water cooler. It's hard to believe, right? So, but let's go, to Torah, and we see at the end of the last week's parsha, the opening parsha Bereshit, that God is in a bad mood at the end of the parsha, and he's saying, and he's going to say in this parsha also, he's very disappointed by humanity. God created this species which is intellectually superior to all other species and can build space shuttles and explore outer space and can create science in order to prolong and save life and make life more pleasant and efficient, and also engage in creative artistic pursuits, right? That Bereshit speaks about one figure who was a musician, for example. But God is disappointed by the fact that we abuse our freedom, oftentimes.
We abuse.
Yeah, individually and sometimes as a nation or as humanity as a whole, right? So that's how Bereshit ends. God is a little bit disenchanted with humanity. I once heard a beautiful story that a great Talmudist, Sol Lieberman, asked a Bible scholar called Yochanan Mufs, who is the most tragic figure in the Bible? And Mufs, the professor, thought, and he said, Moses. He couldn't go into Israel. So Rabbi Lieberman told him, I think someone else. What else do you think? He said, King David. He couldn't build a temple. He wasn't allowed. He said, because God told him, you were a man of war. Your son Solomon is a philosopher. He should build a temple. And he wasn't really sure. So finally, Rabbi Lieberman, Professor Sol Lieberman said, God is the most tragic figure in the Bible because God expects great things of us as individuals and as Homo sapiens. And we keep on breaking God's heart. Right? So now we have a parasha called Noach, actually named after a person. That's noteworthy. The first thing that's noteworthy is that we have a parsha named after Noach. And it's interesting, right? We don't have Torah portions named after Abraham or Moses. We do have one named after Noach. Noach in modern Hebrew means convenient or comfortable. And the first thing we see in the opening verse of the parasha is that it says, Ele toldot Noach. These are the chronologies of Noach. Noach ish tzadik. It says that Noach was a tzaddik, right? That's we're on page 27, and that's the 6th word of the parsha. Noach ish tzaddik. He was a righteous person, a person who was highly evolved in terms of his spiritual and moral stature. He's the only one who's called a tzaddik in the entire Torah. Can you believe that? Very interesting, right? Nobody. And Rashi asks a very interesting question. He says, well, here's the question. Noach was considered a tzaddik because he lived at a time in which everybody else was morally bankrupt. There's a midrash that says that in that generation, people would steal for the thrill of stealing, even if things were of no worth. So God forbid, if I would see you dropping 5 cents on the floor, on the carpet, I would take your 5 cents and put it in my pocket. What am I going to do with 5 cents? Is there anything you can buy today? Nothing. But people would just steal for the sake of stealing. So there was complete moral and spiritual bankruptcy. Complete lack of moral control and physical control. And Noach was the only guy in town, the only person in town who maintained a certain level of integrity. So Rashi says, one way to look at it, it's a general question in sociology and psychology, what he's saying. You know, psychology always says that there are two determining factors about a human being. And there's always a debate to this day. Nature and nurture. Nature is my genetics, right? That's not something I can... But nurture is the way I was raised. Which parents, which culture, which school, which social environment. So there are people who say that Noach was considered a tzaddik in his generation because it was a terrible generation. So that should be to his merit, that he managed to keep his moral compass intact for a generation that was bankrupt, right? So that's in his favor. That's a sympathetic reading. Other people say, Noach wasn't such a great guy, but if everybody around you is in prison, then you're considered okay even if you're a touch corrupt. So they're saying, you know, had Noach lived 10 generations later in Abraham's times, he would have been considered a nobody. So there are two ways of looking at it, right? That he was a tzaddik in his time. Does that make him an even greater person or not as great a person, right? It also says at the end of that verse, these are the chronologies of Noach. Noach ish tzaddik tamim. Tamim means striving for self-perfection. But at his time, in his generation, et ha'elokim italech Noach. Noach walked with God. Now Rashi notices something interesting. Next week, Abraham will come in. And Abraham, God will tell him, Hitalech lefanai. Go before me, Abraham, so to speak. You lead the way. Right? Whereas here it says, Noach walked with God. He was kind of, he wasn't taking the lead. He was kind of, walking behind. Another thing that's very interesting, Noach didn't start monotheism or Judaism. Abraham did. The answer is, we're going to see, God tells Noach, go save yourself and your family, build yourself the ark. And Noach, what does he say? Hokey doke, no problem. I'll go build it right now in my backyard, in my garage. What about the rest of humanity? What about your neighbors? What about your co-workers? Right? What about your friends? Nothing. Noach is what I would call a solipsistic tzaddik. Solipsism means self-enclosed. You just live in your own head. There are people who are really nice people, but basically they just focus on their own nuclear family. They don't go out and necessarily get engaged in empowering others in the community around them who are not as fortunate as they are. And Noach was that kind of person. The sages say that when it's cold outside, here it's never cold, but if you live in New York, for example, you can do one or two things. You can either buy a warm overcoat, you'll keep yourself warm, or you can make a bonfire. If you make a fire, you can warm other people too. So Abraham lit a fire. He was the first Chabad rabbi. He and Sarah opened the first Chabad house. And he said, come to our house and eat, and we'll teach you how to say a blessing, to be grateful and mindful of what you eat. And when God is going to tell Abraham, in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to destroy Las Vegas. Sodom and Gomorrah. Sorry, I got confused. So Abraham doesn't say like Noach, what do I care? He says, will the judge of the entire earth not act justly? God forbid that you should have the innocent perish with those who are guilty. Does that remind you of something? It's people who criticize today indiscriminate bombings in war. I say, what about the civilians, right? And Abraham starts bargaining with God like a used car salesman. How many tzaddikim, righteous people, will it be enough not to destroy these two cities? It's actually interesting, these two cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, they are the lowest, they're in Israel, of course, by the Dead Sea. They are the lowest place in the world topographically below sea level. Right? The Bible says they were the most corrupt societies in human history. Symbolically, physically, Sodom and Gomorrah are the lowest places in the world. It's very interesting, right? So this is why Noach doesn't get to start the Jewish people, and Abraham does. Because Abraham was a person who reached a highly evolved moral and spiritual level of development, but he was committed to empowering and enhancing others to grow in soul as well. And Noach didn't really care about others. He cared about himself and his family, and he was a law-abiding citizen, and he paid his taxes truthfully and on time. He always stopped at a red light, but what about the others, right? That's not a Jewish model. That's not monotheism. And that's why Noach didn't get to start the Jewish people, and Abraham did. And then it says in the second verse that Noach gave birth to 3 children, Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Now, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, a 19th century rabbi, who's considered the founder of modern Orthodox Judaism, Jewish traditional observance with openness to that which is worthy in modern culture and science, he used to say that this is a typology of different cultures geographically, that Shem is Semites, Ham is Africa, and Yafet is Europe. And I'm not that 100% comfortable with it at all. But I was actually thinking today, Shem, Ham, and Yafet actually represent 3 values in terms of how you live. Yafet is connected to the word Yafeh in Hebrew. Yafa in Farsi, Ziba, means pretty, beautiful. So this is a culture that puts prime emphasis on aesthetic beauty. So you go to Paris, these gardens, these architecture, these museums, right? The design, or Italy, Rome, right? So Yafet is cultures who put prime emphasis on the aesthetic realm of life. Okay? There's nothing wrong with aesthetics, but according to our culture, to Judaism, to Torah, it should be secondary. It shouldn't be, thank you, it shouldn't be primary, right? There is a story in the Talmud about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who according to our tradition, authored the book of Zohar. And how did he write the book of Zohar? He sent an email, of course I'm joking, he went around saying during the time of the Roman pagan empire controlling Israel, that he's not so impressed with the Romans. Because whatever the Romans do, they just do for their own aesthetic and cultural gratification. They built a beautiful place called Rome, but it's just for their pleasure to go to the opera, I'm just kidding, to go to the theater, to go to the coffee place, to sit in a garden and read a book. But there is nothing there of service and devotion to God or something beyond that aesthetic cultural pleasure. The Romans didn't like that too much, so they issued a warrant for his arrest and execution. So the story goes that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, that's what the Talmud says, they went and hid in a cave for 7 years and lived off cherub trees and drank water, and that's where they wrote the book of Zohar. So Yafet is one cultural approach to life. That life is about cultivation of aesthetic pleasure and beauty. Right? A Jewish view of beauty is different. The Hebrew word for face is panim. P-A-N-I-M. The Hebrew word, like visage, right? Face. The Hebrew word for interiority, right? Soulfulness. Interiority is pnim. So, true beauty, congruent beauty, symmetrical beauty, is beauty in which your panim reflect your pnim, your heart and your soul. Otherwise, it's a false kind of beauty. It's a non-symmetrical beauty. We all know there are people in the world that on the face of it can be, they can look great on the outside. When you look a little closer, it's not so pretty, right? Or when you see them, talking to the secretary, I don't know what, right? So So that's what Judaism says. So Yafet is putting primacy as a culture or as an individual on the cultural aesthetic dimension of life. Then comes Cham. Cham literally means hot. And that's temperament. People who are completely driven by their emotions. And they can't control their emotions. They're enslaved to their emotions, right? The emotions are the horse, and wherever their emotions take them, that's where they go. That's another model. And then you have Shem. Shem is us. It's the Semites, right? So that's, why do we say that hatred of Jews is anti-Semitism? It's from Shem, the Semites. That's us. And Shem means name. We know that in the Sephardic tradition, our tradition here, when we say an Ashkava, a prayer for the deceased, the first thing we do, we quote a verse from the Bible, from Kohelet, from the Ecclesiastes. He says, Tov Shem Tov, Mishem Tov. A good name is better than any worldly asset. So, what does that mean? It means that we put an emphasis as a culture on our moral and ethical refinement. Right? Our relationship with God and treating others with human dignity. That's the Jewish goal. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs last year wrote one of his weekly Torah columns, and he quoted Robert Frost, my favorite American poet. So Robert Frost, when President Kennedy gave his inaugural address in January 1961, he invited Robert Frost to speak. Robert Frost wrote this famous poem called The Road Less Traveled, about people who have the courage to live their own life according to their own conscience and compass, and not just follow the blind majority. That's what Abram does when he lives in Mesopotamia, and it's a calling for everyone to follow him. Robert Frost also has this great poem called Fire and Ice. And fire is about love, and ice is about hate. And what are more stronger and more destructive things in life. But Robert Frost also has this beautiful poem where he describes himself. He lived somewhere on the East Coast, taking a walk in the forest during the winter and seeing the beauty of the trees and the beauty of the snow resting on the ground. And he says, I don't remember the words of the poem, but of course he writes in a very ingenious way. He's breathing the cold, fresh air. He's looking at the woods, at the trees. He's looking at the snow. And he marvels at the aesthetic beauty of nature. The trees and the snow and the crisp air. And he wants to linger and look at it further. But then he remembers that he needs to go home. That he has a family to take care of. That he has moral obligations. And he says in that poem that he wants to stick around at the beauty of nature. But then he says, but I have promises to keep and things to do before I sleep. Before I sleep, he means before he dies. Yeah. So we all have promises to keep and things to do before we sleep. Right? It's not the Jewish way to say, I'm just going to retire to southern France and not follow close my children and my grandchildren, or not be involved in the Jewish community, or not care about what happens to American society, right? We have promises to keep and things to do before we sleep. So that's Shem. That's our culture, right? And then the next verse says, the entire earth became corrupt, and Rashi says, by way of exaggeration, that even animals, lower species, started misbehaving, so to speak, and the earth became full of Hamas. Hamas, of course, today is the Islamic militant organization, the terror group in Gaza that wants to destroy Israel and won't recognize Israel in any borders. Even if we say, can Israel be one neighborhood in Tel Aviv, they still won't accept it, right? So it's interesting that the word Hamas means violence in Torah Hebrew. Also, we all know the worst enemies of humankind were the Nazis. In the Torah, you have the word mena'atzim or lena'etz, means to destroy, to annihilate. And of course it's interesting because the Nazis had a genocidal agenda towards the Jewish people and other people. It's also always interesting to see that the worst enemies of our people the people who were the most vicious, murderous anti-Semites, were also the greatest enemies of all of human civilizations, right? The Stalinists, the Nazis, they wanted to destroy really human civilization as we know it. And because the basis of human civilization is human rights, human dignity, we're all in God's image, these things originate from the Torah. That's why they targeted us. Now, in verse 13, God says to Noah, Ketz kol basar ba lefanai. I'm going to destroy every flesh. Now, I want to tell you another thing. I started our conversation talking about Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, right? That spoke about the world created from a struggle between the gods. I want to tell you another secret. It's not a secret, it's secular scholarship. I think that there must have been some sort of a devastating tsunami in the ancient Near East that this is describing. Why? Because there is a non-Jewish book called the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can Google it in your own spare time. And in that book, the Epic of Gilgamesh, they also mention a flood, a devastating tsunami of sorts. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods with a small g are just sitting at the coffee bean, and they're saying, you know what? Let's have a flood. It's like a capricious thing. There's no reason for it. In the Torah, the flood is a result of the failure of humanity to live up to its moral obligations. People say that today, most reputable scientists tell us that today we are destroying the world because of corporate greed, right? It's a similar thing. So the Torah has this philosophy that when there are natural disasters, it's time for us to do introspection. It used to not make sense to me. Like the Talmud says, I'm paraphrasing, if there's a devastating earthquake in the Far East, let's say in India or Pakistan, and thousands of people die, God forbid, or the tsunami in Haiti about 20 years ago, that it's a call for us to make tshuva, for spiritual awakening for the Jew. I used to think, what does that have to do with that? And now the way I think of it is that when you see the fragility of life, yesterday my rabbi called me from New York, it broke my heart. His sister is an avid biker, and somebody must have run her over. And she was in a coma for many weeks, and she's like part paralyzed. It's not clear if she recognizes him. You hear things like that. My second cousin in his 30s was killed biking in Manhattan. We've all lost young people that we know to cancer, for example. Right? When you hear things like that, it shakes you to your very core, and you start thinking, I could die tomorrow too. I could be diagnosed tomorrow too. Somebody I know could also be involved in an accident tomorrow too. And that gives you humility. And you start thinking, okay, so what am I preoccupied with? What am I really dedicating my energies to? It promotes soul searching, right? So I wanted to mention that as well. And then God tells Noah to build the ark. And he gives him the precise measurement. And Noah starts building the ark. Why did God tell him to build the ark? God could have told Noah that he's going to give him a magic carpet that is going to float above the water, right? The idea was that other people will see Noah building the ark and say, Noah, what's going on? Are you going on your own cruise to Europe? Why are you building an ark? Right? Maybe give people an opportunity to repent. But, that doesn't happen. Now look at verse 18. It says, the first three words in Hebrew, God says to Noah, V'hakimoti et briti itach. I'm going to sustain a brit with you. Right? Like brit milah, or a bris, as many Jewish Americans say. What is brit? Brit, friends, is one of the most important concepts in Judaism. A brit is an undying, unalterable, non-changeable, perpetual existential bond.
Covenant.
It's like a covenant. It's a Catholic wedding, so to speak, where you can never get a divorce. God makes a brit with Abraham and Sarah as a family. God makes a brit, a covenant, with the Jewish people writ large at Mount Sinai, which is very special because the entire Jewish people experienced revelation from God on Mount Sinai. If you look at other religious teachings, doctrines, other forms of faiths, usually it's only the privileged leader who experiences revelation, right? A Muhammad or a Buddha, right? Or the Christian Messiah, Yeshu. But in Judaism, the entire people got to experience revelation to a certain extent. That's very special. The Torah says, Hanishma kadav. Did anybody ever hear of such a thing? That an entire people experienced an epiphany, a divine revelation? So the Brit is a very special thing. It's an perpetual, eternal, existential bond that will never be broken. So by making a Brit, a covenant with Noah, later on after the flood as well, God is making a covenant with all of humanity. And it says that all of humanity needs to adhere to 7 mitzvot. The main ones are not to murder, not to steal, no cruelty to animals, no idolatry, setting up courts of law and order and justice, right? These are the main building blocks of what it means to be a civilized moral society, for any society. There was a time in the early 80s that the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, Zchuto Yagen Aleinu, of righteous memory, used to have the Chabad Hasidim distribute cards with the 7 Noachite commandments to any Americans who walk the street, Jew or non-Jew. So notice, the first covenant God makes with all of humanity through Noach, right? Now, and you know, it's a very deep thing, because if you think about it, the covenant that God has with humanity, the covenant that God has with the Jewish people, it really talks about loyalty, talks about faithfulness and loyalty. Because in human society, most of our relationships are not covenantal relationships, right? If you hire someone to be your CPA or your lawyer or whatever, it's about their job performance. You evaluate them all the time. If they do a good job, you keep them. If they don't, you don't. It's not a covenant. A covenant is a spiritual relationship that you say, you know, this person is going to be with me by hook or by crook, right? That's a covenant. And the other thing, now I want to tell you the Hasidic and Kabbalistic interpretation of the story of Noah and the flood. And that is, I think, hope maybe the best thing that we'll talk about today, and the deepest. So, you know, Kabbalah is the deepest layer of understanding Torah. It's like the body has different layers from the skin down. And Maimonides says the philosopher walks in the inner gardens of Torah. And Kabbalah is called in Aramaic Nishmata Deoraita, the soul of the Torah. And then you had the Hasidic revolution. Modern Hasidism started in the 1700s in Eastern Europe. And these people sat in poverty, in cold weather, in political discrimination. And they looked at these stories from the ancient Near East, and they basically said, okay, so there was a flood thousands of years ago in the ancient Near East. What's it got to do with me? In Russia, in 1750. What's it got to do with me in Los Angeles in the Jewish year 5780, the year 2019 in the Gregorian calendar? And the Hasidic tradition started reading the Torah with a psychological lens, that it's a teaching for us as individuals. And here comes the Hasidic genius. How do they understand this story? They're saying, we think about finance. We have financial issues for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren to go to college or get a mortgage one day, whatever it may be. We have psychological, emotional, mental issues. We have family issues, we have social issues, we have community issues, we have political issues for Israel, for America, right? We have, and these issues are not easy. Sometimes they flood us, right? The world can flood us. We can become overwhelmed and feel like we're drowning. There's a beautiful story that somebody came to the place where the Baal Shem Tov used to pray, and he saw a fellow Jew gesticulating, making crazy gestures with his hands and body as he was praying, and he started giggling. And the Baal Shem Tov told him, let me ask you a question. If you would see that very same person, that very same Jew, making those frantic bodily movements in the middle of the river, would you also laugh? He said, no, because I would think that he's drowning to death. He says, that's why he's praying like that, because he feels like he's drowning. We all feel sometimes like the world can flood us, right? That's why sometimes we say when the stress and the pressure of life is too much, we say, I can't take it anymore. We feel like we're flooded, right? So that's a Hasidic gene. Says we all feel flooded by the world to varying degrees. Sometimes the sea of our life circumstances, the waves are very, very high, and then you have to enter the ark. What is the ark? The ark is a safe cocoon of mindfulness that can lift you above the flood and keep you safe. And 5 minutes. And one, they're saying that God tells Noah, Tzohar ta'aseh b'teiva. Tzohar can mean two things according to the commentators. It could mean a light, a luminous insight that you get from prayer, for example, or it can be a precious stone. The Torah is like a precious stone. It's a precious, priceless commodity. Somebody who is a jeweler and used to carry diamonds in business would fly from America to Europe to Israel, once met the Lubavitcher Rebbe and said, Rebbe, I have a question. You know, I'm an observant Jew. I put on tefillin every weekday. When I go on business trips, should I take my tefillin bag with me as a carry-on on the plane, or should I send it in the suitcase luggage and pick it up at the next airport? So the Rebbe answered him with a question. He said, let me ask you a question. When you go on a business trip, the diamonds that you carry, do you send them in the luggage or do you take them on the carry-on? Right? That was his answer to him. So the Torah is the most precious thing. It gives us insight. It gives us joy. It gives us friendship. It uplifts us. Right? So that's the thing that God says you should make it Tzohar in the ark. It means two things. It means Torah in general, studying Torah, practicing Torah, doing mitzvot between one another and us and God. And it's prayer. For the Hasidim, prayer has privileged status as a mitzvah. Why? Because prayer is where you can achieve soulful unity with God. And you forget yourself into God. You have a holy merger with God. It's like I take this water, pour it into the ocean in Santa Monica. This water will just be part of the ocean. So prayer can really redeem us from our individuality. And then we finish prayer, we go back to being in the world. Shabbat is also an ark. Shabbat is also a cocoon where the more we get into Shabbat, the more the world can't flood us. If I tell the world, I'm keeping Shabbat such that I don't use my phone on Shabbat, then everybody who knows me knows that they cannot expect me to answer their emails or their phone calls that are, for example, work-related on the Sabbath. You know, and you don't have to be like an Orthodox Jew to do that. For example, you know, we have a friend, Hani Amado, who's a lawyer. She's an avid leader in the Reformed Jewish world and a very successful lawyer. Her clients know that on Shabbat she doesn't use her email, right? So it's not all or nothing. But basically, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, one of the greatest rabbis of our time, and himself a Baal Tshuva, wrote a book about Tshuva. You know, embracing observance later in life. And one of the chapters is called All or Nothing, a False Dilemma. You know, sometimes people think, oh, but I'm not doing this and that, so I'm not going to do this either. But that's really, I think, the best interpretation of the whole story of Noah and the ark that speaks to us today. And I think that we need the ark of Torah, of prayer, of Shabbat, more than any other generation in human history. You know, Sheryl Sandberg, who was Mark Zuckerberg's sister from Facebook, she has his own company. She's very connected to her Jewishness. I think she had a friendship with the late Shimon Peres. She said at some point she got so psychologically dependent on being online and Facebook and Instagram. So she declared that she's going to give herself a digital Shabbat. On Shabbat she's not going online. And it's very interesting because I think I mentioned it on Shabbat in our class, that in Kabbalah there is a term called masach or masachim, which means screens. It means this world is full of curtains that block God's light. We can't really feel and be sensitized fully to God's presence. We wouldn't be able to continue and to survive and to contain the intensity of God's light. It's kind of like, imagine a night light by your night table, and you put like 12 t-shirts on it. The light becomes very dim. That's God's light in this world. So there are all these screens. But now we have these wonderful screens that we have the whole world at our fingertips, and this can be our office, and we can learn, and we can see people in Israel and talk with them. Many wonderful things about this, right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe, for example, was one of the first ones who realized that you can use technology for Torah. And when the radio came out, he was so excited. He says, let's do Torah programs on the radio. He wasn't one of those rabbis who was afraid of technology. But at the same time, we can become enslaved to those things, addicted to those things, to the extent that we can't sit alone, even in the bathroom, without them. Right? And that is not good, because psychology tells us that one of the important things that we should have sometimes the capacity to be alone. Not all the time, but maybe a little bit. You just sit with your thoughts, with your feelings. So Shabbat, for example, or what we're doing now, you know, we go to a screen, we watch TV, or whatever it is. But now we haven't been using screens for like an hour and a half. We've just been connecting to each other, right? And to the beauty and wisdom of our tradition. And so the Hasidic master says, you know, Shabbat is an ark, Torah study is an ark, prayer is an act. A face-to-face encounter with a fellow human being, not to go see a movie, but to sit with another person and have tea or coffee. That's also an ark, right? So I think that the ark of soulfulness, of intimacy, of an unmediated human encounter is something that we need more and more in the world today, that ark. I think more than any other generation. So, you know, these I think are some very good illustrations from this week's Parsha, Parshat Noach, why we say in the last paragraph of the Amidah, where we say, Sim Shalom, Tova Uvacha, bestow peace and goodness and blessing upon us, we thank God because God gave us with His luminous countenance, Be'ol Panecha. What kind of Torah do we say? Torat Chaim. A Torah of life. Not a Torah that has smart ideas that stay on the bookshelves, like Aristotle's philosophy, but the kind of wisdom that translates itself into really changing and transforming ourselves for the good. That's why the Hebrew word for law, chok, comes from the same root as lechokek, which means to engrave. So when we practice Torah, it's engraved in us. It really changes us. Our character, our emotions, everything. So hopefully, with God's help, we will empower ourselves to take all these ingenious commentaries from this week's Parsha to better our lives and the lives of others who are part of our lives. Thank you very much. Okay, great. So,
Very
yes,
nice.
Mark.